What should be included in the other expenses section of your budget in a grant application? That's what we're going to be talking about in today's video, and I'm going to explain a few of the most commonly forgotten or misunderstood aspects of items that can be attributed to a particular program, project, or initiative within a grant application. We're going to talk about some tips on how to get the most out of this particular sort of ambiguous section in a grant application. And then we're going to talk a little bit about justification. So I'm Benjamin Dean from grantgetting.com. Thank you for jumping into this video. I hope you enjoy it, as well as the other videos on this channel, which are aimed at helping you get more grants. In the description of this video, there's a link to a free download for more information on this topic relating to other expenses in your budget. So the first caveat to this entire conversation would be how indirect expenses or overhead, organizational overhead relative to a particular program is stated or is asked for in the application, whether that's in a question or whether that's in the particular budget template. How are you being asked for your indirect expenses? So that is the first thing to consider before you would jump into what is an other expense, what is a miscellaneous expense. So on some grant applications, you're going to see a cost rate of say 5 to 15%, typically around 10% or 12% suggested for indirect expenses. Now, in some applications, they will define this for you. In others, they will not. If you are given if you're looking at an application, there is an indirect expense allocation that's suggested or offered for you to sort of fill in of a particular rate or percentage of the total budget, and there is no definition for what that means, you really should ask. And again, reference some of the other videos around communications and how to do that, but that's a wonderful question. What counts and what doesn't count, or what is preferred and not preferred when it comes to the indirect cost rate? Okay, so you'll want to do that pre-work to have an understanding of what you would normally expect to be indirect in terms of that program you're applying for, so that you come into that conversation in an educated way. But that's number one. Figure that part out. Based on the definition of that, then you're going to know basically what can and cannot be an other expense. Essentially, that which is attributable to this program that is not attributable to the indirect definition, that's something you want to consider. And I have some examples of those. Now, the other scenario is you'll be asked to put together a budget, and there won't be a particular predefined line item for indirect expenses. The first question I would ask, or one of the first questions relating to that budget, is it acceptable to have a standard indirect cost rate? So as to say, it would make this grant budget the same as another one that does have an indirect cost rate. You're just simply placing that item, that line item into the budget and saying, I am putting in 10% or 12% amount on top of the itemized costs of this budget. So if that's allowed, then you're back on the same track in terms of defining what indirect is, and that which remains that is still attributable to the program is what to consider for other expenses. The other scenario is a grantor will say, we don't do that indirect percentage, right? So you actually need to list out every expense and justify every expense that you have in order to submit this budget. So in that case, then this sort of other expenses discussion becomes even more important, because you're going to be itemizing many things that you would otherwise be able to just throw into an indirect cost rate. Those would be things like your rent for your facility, or particular administration of the organization, insurance, things that you're having to purchase anyway, irrespective for the most part of the particular program, project, or initiative, but are also needed for the program, project, or initiative. So that's usually what's in indirect. If there's no indirect, then you may have the opportunity to include much more in your other expenses than what we are going to cover here. So that's the framework for this, at least how I think about it when I'm looking at miscellaneous expenses or expenses that are commonly forgot or other expenses. Okay, so what qualifies as another expense, as an expense category that might be called miscellaneous, is again dependent on the grantor. So once you get to this level and you have some idea of what you might be able to attribute in here, there still needs to be some question, some answer, some clarification with the grantor. But this list that I'm going to talk through is basically things to think about that aren't so obvious. Okay, you're usually going to have sections like personnel, supplies, equipment, travel. These sorts of things are usually predefined for you. All right, but things that are sometimes forgotten, especially now, number one is licensing fees, which would cover in grant speak, licensing a product can also be software. Just your subscription to a particular software that you're going to use for this program. So that could be registration software, that could be project management software for the project, communication software to be utilized in some way, even if it's prorated among the members of the team. That could be your contact management database or your contact relationship management software, your CRM. That can be a variety of different things. External communication tools such as email services, MailChimp, Constant Contact, things like that. Okay, all of those software, typically there's an aspect of them that you're utilizing for the program. So as with any expense that you have in your organization, you want to have gone through the process of allocating a percentage of that particular expense to each program. All right, so that's really a step one before you get into this. You can do it as you go, or you can have one big day where you say, let me look at every expense that we have and we project to have on the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis, let me just list out all my programs, right? Let's start to at least ballpark a percentage of use, management, fundraising, and then your programs, right? And then you split them out and everything in total adds to 100%. Software is one of the most common things that grant writers are forgetting about right now, many times because they're external to the organization and they're actually not even aware of all the pieces of software that are being used for different purposes and how they interrelate with program management. So that's number one. Also in licensing fees would be sometimes you need permits. That sometimes is called a license. Business permits, business licenses to operate in a particular geographic area or with a particular demographic. The other thing would be sorts of required certification for an individual or multiple individuals. One common one is if you're dealing with a particular type of equipment, and you need at least one person, or you should have at least one person on your staff or volunteer base who is certified to operate that typically you might be able to say that's licensing. But in any case, it's a certification. So that's something that typically is not thought about, could be included in the other expenses. Depending, again, on the answer to the overhead question is insurance. So what is most commonly thought of in terms of spreading out the overhead is rent. That's the most common one. But insurance is also another one. And depending on the grant opportunity, you can include insurance costs for a particular project or activity. Now, one little trick of the trade is to include an insurance waiver or a rider, or it's a rider, not a waiver, excuse me, an additional document to your insurance policy that more specifically covers the activities of the particular project that you're doing. One, you want to do that for clarity's sake with your insurance company. That reduces your liability. I've seen a lot of insurance policies where the organization has a very general insurance policy, like so general. We help people do things, right? And there's not an extremely detailed operational description anywhere in the documentation with the insurance company. Well, that is a liability for an organization, because if there were to be an incident that would require a claim, let's say an injury among a staff member, then of course the first thing the insurance company is going to do is look for a way out, right? They're going to look at the policy and say, what was written, what was articulated to us in terms of this particular policy, and what was this situation that you're in. And this is more common than not in terms of claim denials. And sometimes it's not catastrophic, but sometimes it's a couple hundred, a couple $1,000s that would otherwise need to be covered by that individual organization. So this process serves two purposes. One, if you can get a very specific project description to your insurance company to be put on the policy as a writer or as an addendum or as some additional document, and it's accepted, then you now have potentially even the costs of that additional part of the policy. If not, there's an easier case to be made to prorate some of those insurance costs for that particular project. Okay, so insurance cost is something that no grantor is going to say, no, please don't have insurance for this. If insurance is an allowable extra expense or additional expense or other expense or miscellaneous expense, then getting it in here is a really good idea. It shows foresight and limiting your liability. Okay, printing and copying. For some reason, I have seen many of the newer grant applications actually not include this. More of the legacy grant applications, again, and I'm speaking non-federal, not federal grant applications are fairly comprehensive. So they're, a lot of this is things to think about and maybe applicable, but this is mostly non-federal in this section. Printing, copying, outreach materials, reports, documentation, standard operating procedures, anything that you're going to need for the operation and sustainability of this program, you want to think about those items. So training manuals, standard operating procedures, the flyers to attract more clients in, the flyers, brochures, mailers, whatever physical you may be working with in your community to attract either more clients or more volunteers in. If you are going to produce a report, a program summary report, that particular summary report may be able to be used for your donors, of course, to say thank you to grant funders and non-grant funders alike, but it could also be used to attract in more partners, more volunteers, more clients, more employees, whatever the case is. There's an aspect of recruitment that is programmatic that is different from the fundraising portion of it. More times than not, fundraising is not going to be able to put in here. It is just typically not done. I have seen some exceptions to that where you're able to roll it in, but most of the time not. So you're looking at things that are very operational, administrative for the particular program. Okay, so that's one that's commonly forgotten. And even if there is a little line item printing and copying, it's these sub uses of that is typically forgotten. Another forgotten one is equipment maintenance. This has sunk organizations' growth. They get a bunch of equipment and they get it paid for, and then there's like tens of thousands of dollars in repairs or service contracts, or they may be in a community where there's just not a lot of price options. You've got just a few people, and therefore they can kind of charge whatever price that they want for a particular type of equipment because it's specialized. That is so important. And if that is allowable, then in your project plan, of course, you want to be thinking about and projecting these expenses moving forward. But if it's allowable, you want to get it in, because those pieces of equipment, you're typically saying, hey, we need this piece of equipment. It's going to allow us to do X, Y, and Z. Okay, well, you've got money coming in now for a program, perhaps previously, where it is a requirement to fulfill that program that this piece of equipment works. The equipment goes down, you don't really have much of a choice other than to repair it. And if you haven't budgeted for that, and if you haven't received grant funding, that can be a real problem for an organization. Okay, so equipment maintenance. I have two others that are maybe the two most important in terms of items that grantors want to see in there. And the first is training or professional development, which are somewhat different, but we'll say for the sake of this, it's training. So training can be money that's allocated to a third-party vendor who provides training, right? And that could be a particular certification. That could be an educational series to get staff and volunteers more spun up on how to de-escalate certain situations if you're client facing. It could be training on a piece of equipment. It could be training on a piece of software, that sort of thing. It could be more in the the professional development category, where it is attendance at an event, at a conference, that's going to enhance the capacity of a particular individual relative to implementing or sustaining a particular program, right? All of those things are examples. Hopefully you took notes on a few of those, are examples of really good things that you want to be able to put into a budget, because it's going to give you, in that justification, more to talk about that points to you as an organization that is looking towards sustainability. It's looking towards being sort of a best-in-class organization. Okay. The last part is specific to the program, whereas training can be a little bit more indirect, slightly, so as to say there's going to be benefit to your organization to have that training for the program and for other programs. But the number one thing that is forgotten is program evaluation. Program evaluation dollars are designated typically for either a staff member or a third party to come in and conduct pre and post, at the bare minimum, surveying or data collection or observation, or a combination of that and focus groups and other things that are happening, in order to determine whether or not the program worked and how to improve it. Okay, so the dollars can be allocated for staff time. They can be allocated for third-party time, contractor time. They can also be, and best practice says should also include incentives for the clients or the volunteers that are going to be participating in actually responding to the surveys or interviews or focus groups, whatever it is. So it's dollars to go out and buy gift cards, typically, to offer out to your community in reciprocation for responding to a survey. Okay, so program evaluation is a whole different topic and is a whole different process management flow that needs to be, really thought about for, sustained funding. But if it's not in the budget, then you're going to be doing it for free and you're going to be taking a loss on it. And if it is in the budget, you can reference it in multiple other sections in the narrative of the grant application. It provides you the opportunity to talk about sustainability. It provides you the opportunity to talk about what is it called? The less than fully funded application, partially funded, thank you. I was just thinking, a partially funded application question. This gives you the ammunition to include in there as well, especially if you're taking what's called an iterative approach and you're doing feedback along the way. You're not just doing pre and post, which is a minimum, but if you're getting feedback along the way, it allows you to change things in your program and adapt to the environment that you're in. Okay, program evaluation. Those are my big ones. These are the types of expenses to consider and why. So this is all under types. The second thing is just, estimating the costs accurately. There is typically going to be, in most applications, less room, less physical character space for you to articulate a justification for these things. But that doesn't mean you should not have a robust calculation somewhere on the back end in case you get asked, or just because it's the right thing to do, okay, to actually have accurate estimates or accurate forecasts. Okay, so for any expense that you have had or that you project to have for a particular project, program, or initiative, you want to have some sort of model, some sort of spreadsheet that says this is how much of this expense goes to this program and this is why. And ideally, the main question you're answering is how does it increase or help sustain or impact the outcomes of the program? Why is this expense necessary? This expense is necessary to achieve the outcomes of this project because why? All right. Answer that question for every expense, even these miscellaneous ones, and you will be more confident and it will reflect in your grant applications and it'll definitely reflect in your grant interviews and your reporting. Finally, the justification, that's where you're going to expand on it. So you're going to estimate your expenses, as I just said, then you're going to justify. So I sort of combine that, but justification, again, is to clearly explain how each expense ties to the work you're doing and how it will impact the project. Okay, so you have your types, you have a big list, you're going to consider some, you're going to estimate the cost, and then you are going to justify. Okay, so I hope this helps in discussing and thinking about internally in your team some of the other things that can be included in a particular grant application. In the description, there is a free download with additional tips on this topic. Check that out before you close this out. Like the video if you liked it, and check out some of the other videos on the channel. Finally, in the comments, if you have questions about budgeting on this particular topic, leave it down there, and I would love to see you in those comments and respond. Thanks for jumping in, and I will see you in the next video.